You're about to hear my conversation with Benoit Gervais and Ono Rutan from the resources team at Mackenzie Investments. Today, we're going to talk about the new Trump administration and what some of the latest executive orders mean for the resource space, why the polar vortex is giving a hint of what's ahead over the long term for natural gas prices, and finally, how AI is impacting the long term trend of electrification. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Information relating to investment approaches or individual investments should not be construed as advice or endorsement. Listeners should seek professional advice for their situation. Welcome to The Invested, a podcast from Mackenzie Investments. My name is Rajan Bansi, Head of Portfolio Construction and Mackenzie Private Wealth. Today I am joined by Benoit Gervais and Ono Rutan, portfolio managers with the resources team at Mackenzie Investments. Benoit, Ono, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rajan. Thanks for having us.
Of course. So I'm going to get right into the questions now. Obviously, as you're both aware, we are speaking on the heels of President Trump's inauguration. We're into the days into the second administration of President Trump. So I'd like to open with a few questions on what the incoming administration is already focusing on and what it might mean for the resource space. So first, President Trump has declared a national energy emergency, and some feel this will accelerate the permitting of oil, gas, and power projects. What's your view on what this specific executive order means for the resource space, energy specifically?
Rajan, that's a movement that started probably under the first term of President Trump. We got a taste for it, but it's also a movement that's pretty broad, not just in the US, but also in Europe, where people have come to realize that there were broader implications to the green choices that they had made perhaps a decade ago. What we know, the transition will cost more. The transition is probably creating large differences in opportunity set when it comes to industrial activity across the globe. And by that, I mean, by making the green choice, you're probably on the margin making yourself more expensive. So if you're interested in creating blue collar jobs, industrial activity, not just restoration and hotel jobs, then you probably have to think very carefully how you're orchestrating a world where we're making the green and perhaps better social choice. There is more to it than just emissions. So I think Trump, like many other leaders around the world, are really coming to grasp with what is the practical choice for my citizens today. Because if I'm just building windmills, there are inflationary pressures. There are considerations around, is it 24/7 power that I'm getting? Or is it just part of the day? Is that suitable for my industries? Is there not a better happy middle? And I think that this happy middle when it comes to oil and gas is, yes, when we've talked about this on previous podcasts, we want a combination. We want a combination that will lead us to the best possible price with the best possible emissions, and ideally something that is made in the Western world as a solution, because we will have a byproduct of new jobs that's coming with this.
Great place to kick off our conversation. I just want to ask you a follow-up question on energy before moving on to my next question, and that is, do you think the relaxing of regulations and permitting for drilling, say in Alaska? I know we're going to get into your thoughts on crude oil later on in our conversation and how crude is really trading in a long-term range. In your view, do you think this increased drilling activity is going to have an immediate impact on this trading range, let alone energy stocks in the North American energy complex?
Not really. Not really. Simply because the lead time to putting a business plan together, not just the permits will be of big help, not just in oil and gas, but also in mining. I'd love to hear Ono on that. But I think that if we want to supply industries with affordable energy, we need to reduce the timelines between when we decide to make a business decision and when does the first dollar get spent? And then finally, when does the first dollar come in? So if we can compress this whole timeline, we will be more efficient. We might make better decisions. But remember, I mean, you're making a decision sometimes in one environment, business environment, and then if the first dollar in only comes in 10 years from now, it is very difficult for anybody. The most clairvoyant leaders will have a hard time in making very good financial choices. Now, if we're talking about 5 years, well, we're talking about something perhaps within the same business cycle. So this is all we're trying to do here. So if we want to be competitive, we have to make good decisions. And I think that's where it starts. For now, oil and gas companies are probably being hurt for like 10 years. Same thing with mining companies. I think we'll probably have a regrouping. They have been quite disciplined, and the shareholders have put massive pressure on them to be more disciplined, i.e., slow the growth. This is risky business, risky permitting. Why don't you just pay us some dividends and give us some buybacks? And that's been the theme here for the last few years.
Great. Thank you, Benoit. Oh, no, yes. Let's bring you into the conversation.
Yeah, I would like to add that the other directives or indications from the Trump government as well into context. Because yes, it might ultimately over time, like Benoit says, over time lead to increased US supply of oil. But at the same time, he's making noise about not buying oil from Venezuela. The US, over the past few weeks, tried to tighten the sanctions on Russia and limiting the flow of Russian barrels. And then there's still the unresolved question what they're going to do about Iran, which is currently also a meaningful exporter to the East. So yes, you might get a situation here where US supply over time could grow, but you have to put it in the context of the global supply demand, which might actually be negatively affected by some of those Trump measures as well.
Excellent. So we've covered energy here in the early stages of our conversation. I want to move over to tariffs. President Trump, although no executive order, has indicated he plans to introduce new tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada that enter the United States by early February. Although you're resource managers, I know you think a lot about inflation. What do you think could be the impact of these tariffs on inflation from your estimation?
Definitely higher inflation, no questions about it. I think that it's not just about Canada and Mexico, it's about China, it's about all the trading partners, Europe as well. So, what we're trying to create here a landscape where industries in the US can perform, produce more goods, generate more income, pay more taxes, employ more people. And it's pretty easy concept. If you can negotiate, at least on some industries, I think that those are blanket statements for now. But I think as the presidentship evolve, will be more precise about which industry he's exactly trying to target. Ideally, I want to have imports as cheap as possible for the things that I can't do or don't plan on doing or don't plan on adding jobs to or collecting taxes. And then everything else where I'm trying to focus on, where I'd like to win, I'd like to put big tariffs on. Because I think I will create those industries under that umbrella, right? And perhaps even collect some taxes and then channel back into infrastructure to support those same industries, for instance. So that would be an industrious plan.
Okay, I want to marry those first two questions into my next question. I've been reading recently that some view the Trump tariff threats not only as leverage to reopen the USMCA agreement on trade, but also to get access to cheaper Canadian oil. Now, what's your take on this, given that right now the United States is, in fact, the world's largest oil producer?
And it's our largest client. So as Canadian, we have to be particularly worried because theoretically, there aren't too many other places we can send it. I think on the margin, some of those barrels that are currently flowing to the US could flow east by rail or west by rail. Pretty costly for us. Additional costs in the tens of dollars. A 25% tariff on $25, if we do the quick math here, is high teens types of dollars, right? So some of those barrels, would they be taxed today? They would end up being a credit, if you want, a collection agency of some sort. the border agency would collect that $17 or so would go in their pocket, but it wouldn't make any difference in a sense to the refiner because they would pay $75 in the end. So if anything, we would probably subtract some of those barrels going to the US, send them on the margin east. That would probably eat into that $17 and boost the alternative for the refiners in the US, right? So they would say, well, if I can't get this Canadian barrel, have to turn to other imports which are not tariffed. So think of a Saudi Arabian heavy barrel, right? Well, we would be importing through the port of the Gulf of Mexico probably. Well, those barrels would come with additional costs of $5 perhaps. So if anything, if you have an industrial policy, you're probably working against yourself trying to tariff Canadian oil. Unless you're thinking that those barrels, no matter what, will come to the US at the same price, in which case you could theoretically lift a 25% tax, put into the bank, reinvest it into other industries or infrastructure, making diesel more expensive for everybody in the US, I'm not sure is helping you towards your industrial strategy.
Great point. A big focus of the administration is obviously America first. From my perspective, I feel like you can make a really strong case for more infrastructure spending in the U.S. in the name of America first. What do you think about this, and how could it play out in the resource space?
Before we go there, I want to make one more comment there about tariffing Canada. Because if the US wants to rebuild, reindustrialize, answers both of your questions, Rajan, they need access to the materials to do so. And a lot of those come from Canada. If you want to improve US farming, you need Canadian fertilizer. Canada produces steel that goes into the US, which you need to build bridges in the US. So I think Benoit said earlier, rightfully, these tariffs right now are just a blunt statement. There is going to be a refinement, and a refinement towards what I can get from Canada, which I want from Canada. How about copper, nickel, the metals needed for the energy transition? Lithium. Canada can be a meaningful supplier of those to the US. So how about threatening the Canada, but in the end come to an outcome where Canada is actually a partner in providing those raw materials for the reindustrialization for the US? And if you take a big view over the past 30 years, the fraction of industrial metals, materials that would go to the US was de minimis. It all went to China because every construction activity was in the East. And we were actually eroding our infrastructure here and our industrial capacity. It is very clear, and it's already started. It has nothing to do with Trump. It has started already over the past 5-6 years. There is an absolute resurgence in construction, manufacturing construction in the US. If you look at the chart, it's a traditional hockey stick, 20 years of nothing. And the past 5 years, it's off to the races, and it's now hitting that scale of 1% of GDP and accelerating. So this is not a small movement, it's a big movement. And the US is going to attract foreign investment. Japanese companies, Mexican companies, they're all going to build their next plant in the US. And that construction activity needs metals, it needs labor, but it also needs all the highways and bridges and railways to connect those plants, for which you need the steel, the aggregates, you need the aluminum, you need the copper cabling to power it all up. So yes, it is already happening, and it's going to accelerate in our view and be very material intensive.
Oh, no, thank you. You've alluded to something that I want to use as my final question on the Trump administration, but also segue into a longer term thematic that the team has talked about, and that is the subject of reshoring. Now, America First implies a reshoring element from my perspective, at least. And I know this is something that the team has believed and published on for some time. Where do you believe we are in this long term thematic of reshoring back to the United States?
Very early. I think we're at the policy stage. There was the denial period, right, where we were willing to invest and subsidize industries that weren't going to be competitive or make us as countries as competitive as we could be. Now we're in the practicals, at the beginning of the practical stage, which is, what does it actually mean? What industries do we need to support going forward? Where can we be competitive? What we know is that we have deindustrialized, largely speaking, in favor of very cheap goods. Probably a lot of them are very emission rich, social issues, and so on. So today we have to say, okay, what is the right choice for our society? We're not going to make everything that China is making, but certainly there are goods and services. Perhaps they're this happy middle, right? So trying to save, for instance, a few pennies, dollars per pound, that is, for steel, to bring it in from China when we have a perfectly acceptable steel industry in North America may not be the wisest choice. It puts our supply chains at risk. It puts jobs at risk. It is not a meaningful cost to the whole supply chain. So why do we not have more steel made in America that costs perhaps cents per pound more, and will probably find its way through the entire cost chains as, the minimus percentage? So you need a policy for this, because if you're isolating each one of those parts of the supply chain, most of the time you find yourself back in China. Now, those are the pennies per pound that we're talking about that are going to make this onshoring effort work or not work. So we live in the world here, Rajan, in my team, where most of our goods are sold in cents per pound or dollars per pound at best. I can fill my whole office with stuff for less than $1,000. Iron ore, I can probably fill my whole office for $100. Those are the coal, same thing. So those are very cheap items. However, they emit a lot. They have a large footprint for the environment. They have a long supply chain, lots of infrastructure, and they can be used geopolitically for negotiation. And that's where we are today. So you have to find out, well, do I have an industrial policy at the primary level so that I can take it to the secondary level, secondary industry, transformation industry? And transformation, people think it's steel, but it's also, making polysilicon that goes into solar panels, polysilicon that goes into chips. So this is where we're finding yourself at the practical level.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned today, Benoit, it's freezing today, and a polar vortex has really had much of the United States and Canada in its grips for much of January, and that's been reflected in natural gas prices, which have certainly bounced off their December lows. But you and the team have published a really longer term thesis on natural gas that doesn't really have much to do with the weather. So maybe talk to us about natural gas and both the short and long term, and why you think there's a pretty strong tailwind to natural gas prices.
So if I roll back the tape 10 years ago, I think most people would have been talking about how low cost would be wind and solar power. And I think technological advancements have made it quite appealing. However, as we knew back then, there's only so much we would be able to take, because there's not 24/7 power. And a lot of those industries, going back to reindustrializing America or the Western world, we need 24/7 power. So what complements this? So we've gone from getting rid of coal, which was base power, trying to keep together your hydropower, which is clean, but there's only so much you can do. Nuclear power is getting pretty expensive to keep it together, meaning a lot of those facilities are old. So really, what is your complement to this? If you can't use nuclear, don't have more than a hydro, don't want to do coal, then that leaves you with gas. And it so happens that America and Canada is really well endowed with natural gas. We can produce it cheaply, combine it with wind and solar, and make it a low emission alternative to the past at a very affordable cost. You're competitive. So low, this natural gas in cost, that we can also export it to the rest of the world, because that problem is not just a problem for us, it's a problem for everybody that's gone to renewables and have probably maxed out how much they can use without disrupting their transmission and their delivery of electricity to their industries. So liquefied natural gas is a way to export natural gas. Is about to take off. We've already grown it, but here we're on the heels of the next 3 years of a doubling of natural gas exports from North America. And I think that's a trend that's unlikely to abate going forward. I think that's a natural complement to what we want to do.
Okay. Now, we talked about crude oil earlier in our conversation, and that's a very different story. Can you just really give us a quick update on crude? Because it sounds like not much in the thesis has changed, but for some in the audience, it might be the first time they're learning of the thesis with regards to crude.
So energy as a whole today is growing probably faster than energy consumption is being growing faster than it's been over the past 10 years, particularly in the Western world. So energy as a whole was probably not growing much more than 0.1% as a whole. Now, if we're reindustrializing, you again think of that 0 to 1 going to 1 to 2. And if we want to do AI and data centers, we're closer to 2 going forward. However, market share wise, oil is losing, right? Is not the basis for electricity, and we're electrifying. All the pieces I've described are electricity, and the cheapest electron will not come from oil, right? So that means that we're likely to see demand growth move ever closer to zero. We're probably not yet at a point where it goes negative. It is the fuel of choice for flying and many other applications, which needs a lot of high density. But supply has been reasonable. So you combine sideways types of demand growth with growing supply, and in this case, we have lots of spare capacity at OPEC. We have Russia and Iran and Venezuela pretty desperate to send barrels, regardless of sanction. They'll try to go around those. Then that probably puts a lid on oil prices. At the same time, we have a disciplined bunch of producers more than ever. So we think there's a floor. So between 60 and 80, you probably have your band here. And that's where you probably want to value your corporation. So we happen to value our corporation at $65 WTI. And many of those super integrateds, particularly European integrateds, will give you, mid double digit types of total return. Pretty appealing. However, we want them to be disciplined. We want them to work with that thesis that oil will not go anywhere fast. And perhaps there's other ways to reinvest your money, like natural gas, like electricity, so that in 10 years from now, we have a very vibrant energy industry, not just an oil and gas industry.
Excellent. Now, we're getting towards the end of our conversation, Benoit and Onno, but I did have a couple more questions I wanted to ask you. And one is, you just mentioned AI. Can you talk about AI and the link to the power grid and electrification and what that could mean for resources?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Because fascinatingly enough, energy demand, so electrical energy demand, is already inflecting upwards. It's been flat for 20 years. We all got very comfortable with a power grid that could absorb population growth and economic growth through efficiency gains. Think about LED lighting in your house, etc. But over the past couple of years, demand is starting to inflect upwards. And the main reason there is, of course, electrification of transport, in particular, EV chargers starting to take some electrons from the grid, and this reindustrialization, which demands a lot of electricity. So you could quickly talk yourself into 1-2% per year electrical demand growth, which is already very shocking for an industry that has been flat for 20 years. But now AI, if you superimpose that on top, you can actually see that growth rate going to 2 to 3% demand rate for the grid. Because those data centers are incredible power hungry. They take more than an entire city. And my kid Googling last night or ChatGPTing, I made him aware that the amount of power he used on his ChatGPT queries was more than what was needed to light up the room and heat up the room that we were sitting in the entire evening. So that's the amount of power that you draw upon with a query in AI. So those data centers come now on gigawatt scale. They are going to be where we are. Countries will not accept data centers to be outside of their jurisdiction. So the US is going to build them in the US, Europe is going to build them in Europe, and they create massive local demand for steady, large-scale power. And the dollars are being spent. You only have to look at the order book for an NVIDIA. Each of those chips is like 700 to 1,000 watt. That's a lot. That's running your oven at home. That's the amount of power for one chip. And those order books are clear for the next 5 years. So this demand is real, it's happening, and it's going to meaningfully demand more power from the grid. Initially, they will try to fill that up with renewable sources because they like to put a clean policy out, those big data center owners. But on the other hand, that doesn't give you the stability and the quantity of power. So we've seen offtakes with nuclear power stations, and now we see more and more gas-fired power stations being built right next to data centers to actually fuel it, which adds to that natural gas demand that we were talking about.
Excellent. Although we're at time, I'm going to squeeze in one last question because what you just mentioned, Ono, it all sounds very inflationary. We talked about tariffs, also sounded inflationary. And we're already looking at data out of the US that suggests inflation is proving to be very sticky. I spend my days on portfolio construction. Can you share a view on how resources from a portfolio construction perspective can actually be used as an inflation hedge?
I think resources and many other asset classes, which tend to be minority classes, minor classes, at least in the recent history, tend to perform better during inflation cycle where inflation is rising. Resources, yes. Gold, absolutely. I wouldn't want to forget asset classes like value, which also have underperformed for the several previous years here. But those are asset classes in the 70s. You got to go back to 60s and 70s when we had periods of sustained rising inflation to see how they were outperforming regularly the rest of the market. So those are very different asset classes. So you have to ask yourself, where is this inflation coming from? And it's coming from a source of demand that's different than what we've seen in the past decade. What we've seen over the past decade and what we're going to see over the next decade is likely to be different. So it's not unnatural to think that different asset classes would likely outperform. So I think for all the reasons that we've discussed today, I think it's pretty obvious how reindustrializing, putting some money in infrastructure, which we have not since 2008, will create a really interesting environment for natural resource consumption in the West.
Very interesting, Benoit, and just fascinating perspectives from both of you, and certainly a very timely conversation. So I think I'm going to wrap up our conversation there. Benoit, Ono, thank you very much for joining the podcast, and I look forward to having you back here soon for another lively discussion.
Thank you, Rajan.
Thank you.
The content of this podcast, including facts, views, opinions, and recommendations, is not to be used or construed as investment advice and is not an offer or an invitation to buy or sell any security. The content of this podcast should not be relied upon for any purposes, and Mackenzie Financial Corporation is not responsible for any reliance upon it. This podcast includes forward-looking information that reflects our current expectations or forecasts of future events. Forward-looking information is subject to risks, uncertainties, and assumptions that could cause actual results to differ materially from those expressed herein. Our views are subject to change based on market conditions. Commissions, trailing commissions, management fees, and expenses may all be associated with mutual fund investments and exchange-traded funds. Please read the fund facts and prospectus before investing. The indicated rates of return are historical annual compounded total returns, including changes to unit values and reinvestment of all dividends or distributions, and does not take into account sales, redemptions, distribution, or optional charges or income taxes payable by any security holder that would have reduced returns.